Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to Riggs Library. This is the kind of day where every class begins with a question. Can we have class outside today? But I want to thank all of you for joining us today for this discussion on faith, public life, and the common good. And it's an honor to welcome the Reverend Jim Wallis, who explores these very themes in his new book, On God's Side, What Religion Forgets and Politics Hasn't Learned About Serving the Common Good. Jim, thank you for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to have this opportunity to be together. We're also joined by Washington Post columnist Michael Gerson and Tom Banchoff, the director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown. And I want to thank all of you for being here to share your perspectives on this critical topic. Tom, I'd especially like to thank you for your leadership of our Berkley Center, which has helped to make Georgetown a fitting place for today's conversation. For 224 years now, Georgetown has been guided by a tradition deeply rooted in our Catholic and Jesuit identity. Georgetown's engagement with this tradition begins with our founder, John Carroll, whose cousin Charles signed the Declaration of Independence and was actively involved in the founding of this new republic. This strong connection to early civic engagement and our location here in Washington has inspired our students and alumni over generations to engage in our world through public service. In fact, our very first student, William Gaston, was elected to the House of Representatives in 1813. Throughout our history, more than 150 members of our community have served in Congress, including 20 alumni today. Ours is a tradition that is deeply rooted in history, but one that is never static. And it's one that we engage in new ways every day through the creativity of the members of our community, individuals who reimagine it and animate it anew to meet the ever-evolving needs of our world. Jim Wallis, in his new book, helps us do just that by exploring the intersection of faith and public life in a way that helps to lay a new foundation for civil discourse and helps us to return, in his words, quote, to an ancient yet urgent and timely idea, the common good. So it's an honor to be able to convene a discussion on this topic this afternoon with such distinguished guests. It's now my pleasure to introduce our panelists. In addition to being a celebrated thinker at the intersection of religion and culture, Jim Wallis is CEO of Sojourners, the editor-in-chief of Sojourner magazine. He regularly publishes columns in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, a frequent contributor on CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News. He's also a member of our community, teaching here on faith, social justice, and public life, and serving as a research fellow at the Berkley Center. His best-selling books, Rediscovering Values, A Guide to Economic and Moral Recovery, and God's Politics, Why the Right Gets It Wrong and the Left Doesn't Get It, have helped to spur a national conversation about the role of religion and values in public life. He has also served on the President's Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, and he has served as chair of the Global Agenda Council on Faith at the World Economic Forum. Joining Jim on the panel is Michael Gerson, a columnist for the Washington Post, who often writes on the topics at the heart of our discussion this afternoon. He's the author of two books, Heroic Conservatism and City of Man, Religion and Politics in a New Era. Michael worked as a speechwriter for President George W. Bush and later became an assistant for policy and strategic planning. And today he, in addition to his work as a columnist for the Post, he serves as a senior advisor at One, which is a bipartisan venture to end poverty around the world. You all may know it as the organization that Bono has contributed so much of his time and energy to. So Michael hangs around with some really cool people. So Michael, Jim, and Tom, thank you for being with us this afternoon and for offering our community the opportunity to engage the urgent questions that we're going to be discussing. And it's a privilege for me now to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, President DeGioia. Thank you all for coming out on this beautiful day. Jim, it's great to have you here to celebrate this important new book, and it's wonderful, too, to have Michael Gerson, who I know has been in dialogue with you about these topics over several years now. There are many remarkable things about this book. One of the most striking, I think, has to do with its genesis, and Jim may talk about this a little bit, taking a retreat, really stepping back in the sort of religious, spiritual sense of the word, but also something new, perhaps, a retreat from politics, cutting oneself off from social media, especially during this last election season, to reflect on what's wrong with America, what's wrong with the world. And then this book, at least as I see it, is a way to re-engage, re-energize, and to provide a new perspective on our polity, on the challenges we face, using this framework, this lens, this powerful lens of the common good. One that, of course, resonates with our Catholic and Jesuit tradition here at Georgetown, but is more important than ever, given the state of our politics, the problems we face, the polarization we face. So it's wonderful to have you here with us. Jim, I want to ask you to present the book, and we'll hear then from Mike, and then we'll have an opportunity for a wider conversation. So with no further delay, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Tom. I love teaching at your place, so thanks for convening us all the time in the way that you. Jack, thanks. It's always a delight to be with you. On Saturdays, Jack was always at the Little League baseball games, which I coach, and so he's a faithful Little League baseball dad as well as a president of Georgetown. And Mike, my good friend, made a comment on the back of the book, which I appreciated, which said, well, Jim and I can have a variety of differences on policy issues. The call to an urgent consideration of the common good is more timely than ever before. So I'll start with the sabbatical I took to write this book. I began in a monastery, the Camaldolese in Big Sur, whose vocation is solitude. And the guests don't even talk to each other. You just get your food and come back to your cell. And my discipline for 3 months was not to engage the political news cycle, not to write, not to speak, not to do interviews. And yet every day I'd get up early and have quiet, and then I would be with the monks during the day, and then the three months I'd think and write all day. But at night, I would watch the news cycle. The more I watched, the more depressing it seemed to me. The polarization, paralyzation, the vitriol, the anger, the fear, even the hatred, and the shallowness. And the more I listened, and the more I read and thought and prayed about this, the more I realized how we had lost something very, very important, this ancient idea that Jack referred to, called the common good, which goes back such a long time. I found things like this. This quote, "This is the rule of the most perfect Christianity, its most exact definition, its highest point, namely, the seeking of the common good. For nothing can so make a person imitator of Christ as caring for his neighbors." John Chrysostom, 347 to 407. 4th century, they were talking about the common good. When we just take care of ourselves and our group and our tribe and our side and our party, we'll all be in serious trouble soon. But when we decide to take care of each other as well, and when we ask the question, who my neighbor is, which is a common gospel question, that's the beginning of the common good. In fact, I think the foundation, the spiritual foundation for the common good, when Jesus said, to love your neighbor as yourself. Now that's in Judaism, Islam, Christianity, and the more I thought about that, again as a dad and Little League coach, I was thinking, that means that I can love my sons Luke and Jack with more than I've ever imagined I could love anyone or anything. That's okay, that's good. But it means I've got to love other people's kids as well as my own sons. And that is a transformational ethic, and it was supposed to be. So how do we understand this common good ethic, which is in all of our faith traditions? It's also, though, in our democratic secular tradition, so that this can be a conversation that we can have on all sides. I mean, Mike and I have talked about these things at Davos, the World Economic Forum, and just around town, and we once were involved in a poverty forum. We had people from both sides, but who cared about poverty, to find what's right and what works. And the conversation in this town is about winning and not governing. It's about campaigning. It's about winning and losing. Both sides take an issue. They want to make us afraid of it and then blame it on the other side. We don't get to trying to solve at the root causes what's really going on here. And so I try and just, the first part of the book is trying to ask what inspires the common good. Now, the common good is, and I look around the room, I see John Carr here and others who are been experts or resource people for me on the common good, so I'm looking forward to our conversation. The book title and the subtitle really raise these questions. I can't tell you the 6 things that make up the common good, but I want to say it's always the right question. It's the right metric, And there are different ways to get to the common good. But there are parts of our political spectrum that really don't even acknowledge the concept, the ethic of the common good. And that has to be, and I would say perhaps on the right, it's the radical libertarian notions that where Ayn Rand is preferred to Jesus here, where the individual is the only metric and not the common good. But I would say on the left, identity politics of various kinds can also be just about our tribe, our interest, our identity. And again, forget to talk about the common good. So how do we inspire it, first of all? So this is the most biblical and theological book I've written for some time. And in the monastery, the first day I went to get my food, and the guest library was in the kitchen of the monastery. Not very impressive, but it was nice. And I looked through it, and I found on the bottom shelf a paperback old version of the Narnia Chronicles with C.S. Lewis, and I got the Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe for the afternoon. I ended up reading them all again. And so this whole chapter here, the lion, the word, and the way, felt like Aslan was walking along beside me in those redwoods in California, a living teacher who really exemplifies to me the common good and how Narnia was meant to be the place where that happened. So there's a lot of biblical gospel talk here, and then there's a lot of good theology. For example, this is all of the best of Catholic social teaching. My friend John Carr knows I'm an evangelical convert to Catholic social teaching. So the common good is the whole network of social conditions which enable human individuals and groups to flourish and to live a fully, genuinely human life, otherwise described as integral human development. And I love this line: all are responsible for all. All are responsible for all, collectively at the level of society or nation, not only as individuals. But then the rest of the book is about how to practice this, how to put this into practice. So I make an attempt to look at the economy. It's called the trust economy. We've lost our sense of trust. Mike and I actually are involved together in the Global Action Council on Values, and we've just put out something called a new social covenant, and Jack's been involved in that for a long time. We have broken social contracts, but what would it mean to do a new social covenant? And it was the business people, the CEOs we talked to, who liked that language of covenant. So this is going to have a year's going around the world, maybe a conference here in the fall. What does that mean? I talk about the uneconomy in this chapter. Uneconomy, unfair, unstable, unsustainable, and making many people unhappy. What does it mean to look at that from a moral point of view? I talk about the role of government. I think the question of big government or small government is the wrong question. What is the purpose of government? And as an evangelical, I turn to the Bible, and Romans 13 talks about the function, vocation, purpose of government. And it isn't big or small. There are purposes government is supposed to fulfill. Fairness being one, our tendency to unfairness, but also in particular to look after those who are poor and vulnerable. That's a biblical function, purpose of government. We look at democracy. I would suggest watching this election on sabbatical. It was clear to me that the checks have replaced all the balances in our public life. Until we deal with the role of money in politics, we're not going to get to what we even call genuine democracy. So I talk about that. The longest chapter at the end is about households, because I really believe, as a dad, that the decisions we make, the choices, how we live as husbands and wives and parents, and in the places where those who are closest to us are close to home, those choices and decisions may be impacting the common good more than what happens outside of our households. So how do we make decisions in our households? It feels like the market economy is aimed at Luke and Jack, to provoke appetites. That's how every parent sometimes feels. How do you teach kids the values that overcome appetites? What does that mean? What does that look like? So we talk about households. So this is about how to live, not just what politics ought to be. And I'll finish by saying, on this, we had a great week of events around Boston, Baltimore, and here. And I always feel people sensing, I can't change Washington. I can't change Wall Street. What can I do? I know you all meet with people and so on, but how do I do that? And they don't have a sense of how they can change Washington. I want to say change comes to Washington last. And it changed things. The civil rights movement happened because of Birmingham and Selma. I'll be with John Lewis in Birmingham Sunday night. We're going to have the 50th anniversary of the letter from Birmingham jail from the king. And for the first time in 50 years, clergy are going to respond to what he said, national church leaders. And we're going to do that in Birmingham. But it was millions of decisions made by ordinary people that caused the success of a civil rights law in '64 and voting rights in '65. Decisions made about their choices, their work, their families, their congregations, their communities. And I love the conversation in the Gospels about who is my neighbor. It's always lawyers who ask Jesus that question. I think they're always Washington lawyers who ask the question. And they're saying, who is my neighbor? And they're not saying with a tone of voice, who is my neighbor I want to help? It's, who is my neighbor? So I can avoid taking responsibility for my neighbor. And the gospel story is always extending the boundaries of who my neighbor is. So we talk about that at length. Who are your neighbors? Do you even know your immediate neighbors? What's that relationship? Who are your poor neighbors? If you don't know your poor neighbors, I mean, I know this town pretty well. There are poor neighbors not very far from here. Who are my undocumented neighbors? On a book tour, you're in hotels all the time, and I guarantee you, all the women who are cleaning my rooms are undocumented in the hotel rooms. My undocumented neighbor. Who is my Muslim neighbor? Who is my neighbor? That question. We had a conference thing at the press club a while back, and on the Congo, and I was the religion speaker over lunch, which you're supposed to inspire people over their sandwiches, and their CEOs and NGOs, and Mike relates to this issue a great deal in the one campaign. I said those dirty minerals in the Congo that are being dirty minerals because they're being used to fund these warlords and their weapons, but they're all needed for our cell phones. So I said, get your cell phones out. And I said, no, get them out. They all got them over lunch. I said, this is your significant other. This is who you spend most of your time with every day now. Whoever helped to make this cell phone, whose ever life was impacted by your cell phone, I would say now, is your neighbor. How do we make supply chains into value chains? They stopped talking. We had a good conversation over lunch. We talk about that in the book. Last thing I'll say is, the thing that's interesting to me right now is Washington, D.C., as those of us pay attention now, is not getting very much right, and may not get much of anything right in these next several months, except one thing. I'm going to predict by the August recess, we will have passed comprehensive immigration reform.
That's likely.
And that means Republicans and Democrats, in a bipartisan way, are going to do something right and do it together. And I'm talking to both sides, and they're very excited about this. They're happy. They're feeling good about doing something like this together for the first time. But they'll be the first ones to tell you that's happening because of the, it's politics, yes, it's about the election and the Hispanic vote, but it's more than that. It's the pressure they're feeling from the outside, And the faith community, I would say, I'll just say it now, we can talk later, the faith community has become more of a political game changer on this issue than anything I've seen since the black church and the civil rights movement. And I'm hearing that all the time. The faith community has become a game changer on this issue. And we're providing two things for the politicians. One, moral courage. The other, political cover. Political cover. So when Lindsey Graham was attacked, there's a group out there who's got $10 million to defeat immigration reform. They have $10 million. They went after Lindsey Graham, and within days, we had evangelical pastors doing radio ads and op-eds all over South Carolina. When they went after Ruby, we had 1,000 evangelicals on the phone the next day. And those senators felt supported by their constituents in those states. So this isn't just sort of an esoteric, theological, philosophical discourse. It's talking about practically how by our choices to treat our neighbors differently, we can mobilize ourselves to even change politics in the end. And movements always can do that. So I'll stop right there.
Thank you. Michael?
My friend Jim Wallis is a man of the left, perhaps the defining figure of the evangelical left, so it's not surprising that I might have a few disagreements with policies and assumptions in this book. But this does not prevent this book from being resoundingly right in its central premise, which is that American politics would be elevated, even transformed, by a renewed commitment to the common good. This phrase, the common good, as Jim points out, is traditionally identified with Catholic thought. Its use by Jim and others, and myself, is further evidence of the intellectual advance of Catholic social teaching across Christian traditions. It was really one of my primary intellectual influences when I came to Washington. You know, some may regard this as the further sneaky stage of the Counter-Reformation, but it has a serious positive influence in American politics. Pope John Paul II defined the common good as the good of all and each individual because we are really responsible for all. It's the set of social circumstances, as you mentioned, that allow everyone to flourish. Jim's appeal in this book is frankly faith-oriented. At one level, Christianity, of course, is deeply individualistic. It promises a personal relationship with the Creator and imposes a set of individual moral responsibilities. But as Jim points out, Christianity is also inherently communitarian. The call, he says, to, quote, a relationship that changes all our other relationships. The Golden Rule and the mandate to love our neighbor challenge social systems based primarily on tribe and class and race. And Christian ethics has been the halting, inconsistent, but continuing struggle to draw out the full implications of God's image in every life. So Christianity is not just a matter of personal morality or piety. It involves a view of social justice. Now that phrase, in my circles, is often taken with a negative connotation, social justice. I think properly understood, it doesn't need to be. Would religious conservatives, for example, prefer to believe that religiously informed views on human dignity are purely private matters? They wouldn't assert that. So nearly every Christian tradition of social ethics encompasses two sorts of justice. The first is procedural justice, giving people what they deserve under contracts and the rule of law. The second is distributive justice, meeting some needs just because human beings are human beings. This is not, in my view, the same thing as egalitarianism. Confiscation is not compassion. But distributive justice requires a decent provision for the vulnerable and destitute. And that is not just a matter of personal charity. Social justice is more than crumbs from the table. It depends on the existence of social and economic conditions that allow people to live, work, and thrive. On God's side, Jim makes a strong case that religion has been central to this, that it's, quote, the best catalyst for movements aimed at improving the human community. And he cites a range of compelling examples from Martin Luther King to Dorothy Day to John Wesley, as well as contemporary examples like the fight against human trafficking, the fight against HIV/AIDS. Jim recognizes a commitment to the common good does not mean that our policy applications are obvious or much less infallible. And we can have a discussion on a variety of those. But the book has a broader value, in my view, serious value in challenging a variety of shallow modern ideologies. Against libertarianism, it says that the common good is not identical to the triumph of market forces, constructing it as the shared duty of communities, corporations, and government. Against some forms of modern liberalism, the common good is not identical to the triumph of autonomy and choice. Humans flourish in the context of binding moral choices such as families and marriage. And the most vulnerable members of the human community, as Jim points out, deserve special concern and protection in society. And against secularism, the common good is not achieved by banishing religion from the public square. Healthy religious institutions perform works of mercy and carry ideals of justice, and these institutions should be sheltered by a generous interpretation of religious liberty. So Jim's argument, made by a man of the left, reaches far beyond the left, in my view. A greater emphasis on the common good would make American politics more civil, more admirable, and more humane.
Thank you very much. We've covered a lot of ground already, and I want to come back to some of the points at which there may be some tension, some disagreement, maybe press you guys a little bit on that. But I first wanted to ask you both, especially Jim, to reflect on the idea of the common good in a global versus a national context, because it is a theme that you come back to in the book and go into in some detail. It's not the focus. The focus is really on the United States and the American political system. But you've got a wonderful header for one of your chapters called The Good Samaritan Goes Global. And there is a kind of universalizing impetus, at least in the Christian understanding of what the common good is. It should encompass all of global humanity. At the same time, one of the problems perhaps with our political system is the persistence of the national frame. And at one point in your book, you suggest that that is a problem. You talk about the need to submit claims of national supremacy to moral scrutiny. Could you say a little bit more about that?
This notion of the Good Samaritan going global, I read the Good Samaritan story at that press club meeting on the Congo. And I find students, I'm glad to see the students, I thought you'd all be on the grass today when I walked in, because so I'm glad to see you all here today. I see one thing technology has done. I see it with my 10-year-old. They can go global so quickly, and it changes the notion of, who's my neighbor? Who our bubbles have really been. There are limits to what technology can do relationally, for sure, but it connects us in ways that we haven't before. And young people, there's a lot in the book about how young people, like in the one campaign, are building campaigns around this note. Well, here at Georgetown, Georgetown products have to be scrutinized by ethical frameworks. It matters to Georgetown students who made the Georgetown sweatshirt. I mean, this is a whole conversation going on around, particularly among younger people. So I think that conversation is, and I've got some narrative from some in the business community where they've been pressed to look at these questions in a way they wouldn't have been had there not been those kind of social movements growing. And in some ways, the corporate world is sometimes easier to move on some things than Congress people who are safe in their gerrymandered districts, as we often see. So, and there's a whole section here as well on how it says the beloved community, going back to King and John Lewis, welcomes all the tribes. In the scriptures, there's this kind of growing sense of diversity. Diversity as a profound gift and not a threat. And I talk about this biblically in Revelation at the end of the scriptures. It's a great text. We're all coming together praising God in our own languages, in our own cultures. There's no kind of common future heavenly language or culture. We all are exactly who we are, praising God at the end of time. And I think that powerful sense of diversity, we saw, Chuck Todd said the last election was a demographic time bomb. He's right. And so maybe elections, we won't see elections won anymore with just white votes, but the old demographic still rules the country. And so how do we deal with this new demographic that is coming into being, which I'll be in Los Angeles next week, it's already out there. So how do we deal with that on a global scale? I think conflict resolution is becoming a vocation for many young people around the world. The inevitability, my theology says, human conflict is inevitable. I'm not a utopian. How do we resolve conflict? And moving beyond traditional, I have a chapter called Surprise Your Enemies. How do you surprise your enemies with more than traditional methodologies, with things that actually can change hearts and minds? So I give examples of where I see it happening around the world. So that global sense of who my neighbor is, the New York subways recently had this hate language on the subways about Muslims, and a number of us put up signs in those subway stations simply saying, love your Muslim neighbor. Just a simple message in the context of hatred and anger. And it was amazing how there in Missouri, where a mosque was burned, in Wisconsin, where Sikhs were killed, how that simple message changed the whole conversation in those communities. So reminding people of those ethics in a global context, I think, is really a very powerful way forward.
Now, Mike, you've reflected and written quite a bit about global development issues. Do you see a tension between this idea of the national common good and the global common good, and what should we do to address it? Yeah.
You know, I don't have any doubt that nations have a particular responsibility for people within their borders and within their care, responsibility to the rule of law. And when you visit places like the Congo, for example, you get an appreciation for the moral nature of that responsibility of nations. Because one of the main problems is lawlessness, the absence of an efficient government in control of its territory, providing basic security. In those circumstances, you see that those national responsibilities are in fact moral responsibilities for the people in their charge. All that said, America has always had a deep ambivalence at the heart of the American experiment that come from being based on a universal creed about universal human rights and dignity. You know, we've never been Americans in the same way Belgians are Belgians. I mean, we have, because of the Declaration of Independence at the foundation of our national creed, we've always had a more universal view on these issues. It's come, I've just seen it, even in the amount of time, the decades I've been in Washington, that tension has come to a head because of massively unequal global development. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But, you know, we faced the situation in 2003 where AIDS drugs were about $300 a person in the West, and only 50,000 people in all of sub-Saharan Africa were receiving them out of needs of tens of millions. Okay? That's never happened in history before, where you had some goods, some global goods, that were, because of technology and wealth, uniformly distributed almost in developed segments that could save lives in other settings. That, by the way, is true on malaria. It's true on the mother-to-child transmission of AIDS. It's true on a lot of different questions. So it's forced us to come to a moral confrontation about the duties we owe others in these settings, when the expenditures that the West can do are minimal compared to the extraordinary outcomes that you could achieve. And I think the proper answer to that is that the responsibilities of America are not unlimited, and they're not the same, but they're not non-existent. And within our power, those things that were within our power are within our responsibility. Right. And that is not all the goods that a nation provides. But it certainly can be when it comes to minimal commitments to human life. And it is minimal in the United States. On humanitarian aid, we literally save millions of lives every year, and we do it with less than 1% of the federal budget. This is and it does relate to our national interest as well.
And that's an example of where we're finding common ground for the common good, less than 1%, yet it's vulnerable. Foreign aid is very vulnerable in the budget deficit conversation. So the circle of protection, which Mike has been supportive of, Galen Carey I saw a few moments ago, there you are, Catholic bishops, National Association of Evangelicals, Salvation Army, not a religious left coalition. We're all together. And one of our common ground places is international aid, malaria, HIV/AIDS. As Mike has said, some cuts kill. I mean, some cuts literally kill. And it's a very small portion of the budget, but you've got the faith community saying, this you've got to protect, and getting both sides to say, you've got to protect poor and vulnerable people here. So just like immigration is becoming a common ground for the common good, so is international aid becoming a common ground for the common good. So when people on different sides of the aisle can speak together on behalf of things with a moral agenda, it really helps provide space for the politicians to do the right thing in regard to some of those questions and choices.
Well, that's a bridge to my second question before we open things up. The book is really, it's a kind of critical appraisal, a diagnosis of what's wrong with the United States, but it's also a hopeful look forward and a call to action. Kind of a new politics of the common good is one way of thinking about it, and how we get there. You seem to suggest it's not something that we can just take for granted as part of our political culture, something we have to work on. It's also not something that we can build just at the elite level. And you talk about the importance of new social movements and cultural shifts. We're at a university, and you've been part of our community for several years now. I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on the role of higher education, whether you see a role for higher education, for universities and colleges in our country, in cultivating an appreciation for the common good, for those values. Is that something that universities can do in their public outreach? Is it something we can do more of in the classroom? I wonder if you each have some reflections on that.
Well, some of the students I've been blessed to be able to teach are in the room today. And I'll tell you, when I come over here on Tuesday afternoons in the fall, it really is often the best part of my week, because you've got these students who you get to be with for 13 weeks. And what I find by the end of that time, the questions they're asking are not just about the content of the course material and the readings and the lectures. What they're wrestling with is their own vocations, their own vocations. So higher education to me in this context isn't just about information, it's about formation. And particularly at a place like Georgetown, that's a little harder to talk about at Harvard where I've taught, but here, what does it mean to look at higher education in terms of formation in terms of vocation? I've got students in my class who's decided, and then their papers become part of this, what kind of doctor they're going to be. There are choices, what kind of doctor you want to be. I've decided I'm going to teach in a Catholic high school, and I'm never going to make as much in 1 year as it cost me to go to Georgetown for a year. But I'm making that choice, and those vocational conversations to me are at the heart of what I think higher education, particularly in a context that is, as Jack was saying, is a context of, there's a theological context here. And I think it's more than just intellectual discourse, which is rigorous here, which I love, the discourse here. But it's really about formation and vocation, shaping that. And that's what I love about my class. That's what really happens now every year.
Mike, did you have any thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, I would only add that one of the possible, and Jim and I have focused on this some over the years, but one of the sources of possible agreement in our society is focusing on the growing class divisions in American society that are rooted in education, family structure, and the economic and social health of communities, okay? Which are increasingly placing maybe 1/3 of American workers out of kind of the stream of social capital that's necessary for competition in a free market. That's the kind of thing that should unite the country to look at this deep source of future national division based on opportunity. I have thought, and we have argued, that could be a common ground theme, not equality or individualism, but equality of opportunity as a kind of theme, and what are the preconditions that allow that to take place. And education is absolutely essential to that, by the way, not just preschool, which is important, not just basics of reading and math in elementary school, not just high school graduation, but actually increasingly college attendance and graduation for minorities in America. Those are the routes to mobility in an increasingly meritocratic society. So I think that there are, on that agenda, there needs to be some kind of coming together around that set of issues.
Wonderful. Well, we've got the better part of a half hour for a wider conversation. We've touched on a lot of themes. We've got a roving mic over here. Let's start up in the front row with Galen. Here, I'd ask you to briefly introduce yourself and make a short reflection or pose a question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Galen Carey with the National Association of Evangelicals. I wonder if you might talk a bit about the intergenerational nature of the common good. And just to illustrate, I was at a breakfast this morning where a senator was talking about his concern about the budget deficit as an intergenerational issue. He said, you know, no parent would max out all their credit cards with the plan of handing the bill to their grandkids. But then his prescription for how to deal with this is to aggressively develop all our energy resources in a way that many observers think would be also harmful to future generations. So how do we balance those the needs of people right now and needs of future generations that we're also going to bequeath something to?
In our Global Action Council on Values that Mike and I get to be a part of with Jack, you know, this metric always is interesting. At Davos, you've got a conversation about if the metric is quarterly profit and losses for shareholders, if that's the only metric that you've got, you really are in serious trouble. So Klaus Schwab, who's been there for years, found a place, has always talked about, you know, stakeholders and not just shareholders. But that metric, I always like to think of indigenous people. They will tell you that you make a decision today, their ethic would say, based on its impact on the 7th generation out. Now, that's a very different metric than quarterly shareholder profit and loss statements. But a stakeholder notion has workers as stakeholders and consumers and the environment becomes a stakeholder and the next generation does. So how do you look, and in Davos there's a lot of talk now about short-termism versus long-termism. It's a big conversation. So in this social covenant we talk about how you've got to, we're going to be making choices, decisions based on our values. They're going to be value-driven choices and decisions. So as Mike said, I like this so much, we put it in the intro to the social covenant, be as self-conscious as you can about what your value choices are. So we've lifted up 3. One is human dignity, one is the common good, and one is stewardship, this notion of stewardship of posterity and the planet. And it was interesting at Davos how much those values resonated with people. Sure. And there's the young global leaders, YGLs, that's what they're 30 to 40 or so. Then there's the new group, the Shapers, they're in their 20s, and they have loved this conversation because it is about how to connect. Now, interesting, they're cynical about politics, but they want to give their lives for the common good. They really do, but they're cynical about politics. So how do we overcome that political cynicism, yet talk about what it means to commit the common good with that generational view in mind? So the nice thing about this book tour for me, I'm in my 60s now, and I guarantee you half the audiences will be under 30 at every step along the way. And that's now always my experience, and that's, to me, one of the most hopeful things about this conversation.
I would just point out, substantively related to that issue, that discretionary spending in our budget, all those things we do on education and poverty and global health and all those things, have been almost completely stable for 40 years as a percentage of our economy. We have not had large increases in discretionary spending. The almost exclusive driver of future debt is the combination, which no one intended, between an aging population, health cost inflation, and entitlement commitments, particularly Medicare and Medicaid. We've got to solve that problem. Otherwise, we're involved in a massive intergenerational transfer of wealth from young to old. As I said, no one designed these programs this way in the 1960s. They didn't foresee that all this would happen. But I think our politics is going to require that adjustment. But it's going to have to require it in a timely fashion so that you don't have to have major dislocations in the adjustment that needs to take place. And the real question is whether our politics is now capable of such things. And so I do think that a concern for posterity really should be animating some of our budget debate. It doesn't determine the outcome of all these very difficult, politically difficult issues, but I think it's the reality we're facing. So.
Okay, was there a question over here? We're still back in this corner. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jacob Votter, second-year master's student in the School of Foreign Service. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the extreme right and the extreme left, polarized right, polarized left, they both say that what they're pushing is for the common good. It just seems like their visions are so far apart that coming together looks almost impossible. So how can we bring those two groups together and try and work towards a common good? Is it a matter of seeking space of agreement and then saying we agree on these values provided we're not asked why? Something like that?
That's an excellent question.
I think it's a very difficult question, and it points to the fact that the polarization we've seen has structural roots. Okay, we've seen the ideological and geographic sorting of the parties, okay, by ideology, and we've seen the growth of partisan media, which is really designed to provide people ammunition rather than information. And we've, we've seen the growth of gerrymandering, by which people in the House of Representatives, when I talk to them, very well-intentioned people, their only real concern is being primaried, because it's the only race that matters in their own district, and that skews politics in a certain direction, in both left and right. So I think we have to take seriously that there are structural roots. It's not just bad intentions in American politics. We need to identify those things and confront them. But I agree with Jim that leadership can matter in these circumstances. You may think he's terrible on a bunch of other issues, but somebody like Marco Rubio has gone out and taken risks, real political risks, in order to try to make some progress on that side. And there are Democrats that do the same on the budget side to try to take risks on entitlements, which I think the president has done somewhat on Social Security in this budget and opened himself to some But that's very much like walking out on the ice, and you have no idea whether it will break beneath your feet. And it could, by the way, on immigration. I think it won't. I hope it won't. But that's why we still depend on leaders, smart, effective leaders, to try to raise these issues in the most persuasive public ways and build the coalitions that are necessary. And I'd only add one other thing, that the parties' opportunities open up on key policy matters when parties have exhausted the alternative somewhat, and Republicans are in the active process on immigration of exhausting their political alternatives. And so I think now you have an increasing coalition within that that's not just people who are right on immigration, but people who want a national party. You know, having gone from, when we ran in 2004, we lost the Hispanic vote by 9%, and Mitt Romney lost it by 44%. That's not consistent with having a national party, you know, 20 years down the road. So people do eventually learn lessons, but sometimes it's when they exhaust the alternatives.
I think it's structural. I agree with that. It's also, there's a cultural thing that's changing. There was a letter written by former members of Congress, Republican, Democrat, that got no attention in the press at all, but I put it in the book because I really was moved by it. These are all formers, and they're saying, we were always adversaries. We didn't treat each other as enemies. And we would agree on something together this week and not something next week, but you know, we decided what we thought, and we had debates, rigorous, but we didn't call each other evil. We didn't try to undermine the integrity or the patriotism or even the faith of our opponents. And so members that talk to me about this, they say it really is worse than they ever remembered being. Families are not living here, so you don't know your colleagues, you know, the spouses and kids, and playing Little League together and drinks and dinner. That doesn't happen as much. I mean, I'm told people aren't even talking in the hallways sometimes to each other. So there's a structural thing. The impact of, we've talked about this, how people are turning more and more in media, getting their information from the sources that always just feed their prejudices. They're not looking to, I find the columnists that I try to read are the ones who I don't agree with, because they'll push me and stretch me and make me think a little bit. But more and more, I remember we had lunch one day, I talked about this, Mike was saying, people are going to the same sources for their news that already agree with their prejudice. And the language, people up on the Hill are afraid of radio and television talk show hosts. They're afraid of being talked about. They're afraid of their being primary. That's one fear. They're afraid of being attacked and named, right. Yeah, pilloried by the pundits. So there is a very kind of and it's not about solving. It's about blaming. You know, it's not about solving a problem. How do you solve the real problem of increasing healthcare costs and protect the vulnerable at the same time? That's a vexing problem. But, you know, death panels aren't going to solve that. The rhetoric really is ugly. So it's structural and it's cultural, and I agree with Mike. Leadership, when someone sees, when we see leadership, we're drawn to it. We see in Pope Francis now, just Maundy, Thursday, being with the inmates and having women there as well, and Muslims, and washing the feet of Muslims and women. This goes around the world. It changes people's perceptions of a church. So leadership is critical here, in politics, in vocations, in the churches. I think this is really a time for leadership, and the first line of the book says, our life together can be better. You know, it's like people are hungry to believe that our life together can be better. So whoever can show that by leading in that way is, I think, going to get a lot of response from people.
Just a quick comment that the question raises this critical issue of, is it all just rhetoric? I mean, is the common good one of those phrases like the national interest or the public interest or the general welfare that you always claim for yourself and you deny to the other? That's an old story in American politics. Leadership's important. One sort of interesting empirical test, I think, is somebody willing to make sacrifices? Is somebody willing to make a material sacrifice, a group or an individual, across some divide, whether it's a generational divide, regional divide, or a class divide? Let's come out and say that to address these common issues, we're going to have to all make sacrifices. And that's a discourse that's been missing in our politics, where I think our traditions do have some resources we can bring to bear.
Language of the common good. Yeah. I'm not sure that I hear people say what you said, the common good. I hear them say this is right, it's the truth, it's our principles. But the language, like Mike said at the beginning, the language or metric of the common good is one that I'd like to see invoked, because that has some content, some history, it has some meaning. Okay, for the common good, then what do you do about this and this and this and that? So I think that language could help frame the conversation.
All right, now the hands are starting to fly up. So let's collect only this side of the room. No one. There we go. All right. Are there any other students too? All right, students, think about a question. Let's collect three. Hopefully we can do two groups of three. One here and then one up here. Someone's been waiting, and then John Carr over here. And then we'll get a couple more. Yeah. Please. You can stand up and introduce yourself.
Neil Bliven with the fundraising office for the university's Cancer Research Center. My question is not about cancer, or maybe it is in terms of the politics, but in your research, did you do any historical research, say about 200 years ago, say 1813, during the time of the War of 1812, it seemed like there was a similar kinds of name-calling in politics and a division of the northeastern United States, southeastern United States, western United States, having a different view of the common good, which actually led some to oppose a war and some to desire a war. Just wondering if you did any historical research that far back in America, and given that there was the fomenting of a great awakening coming about at that time as well.
Okay, let's right up here pose a question.
My name's Rick Barry. I'm here with Grace DC. My question is going back to a little bit earlier. You guys said that the change was not going to start on the level of the elected officials. And that feeds into a little bit about the comments you were making about their only real challenge and the only thing they need to worry about being primaries. Based on the campaigns I've done in different pockets of the country, in rural areas, suburban areas, urban areas, most of the people I've met are more committed to trying to find some notion of consensus on what's good for everyone, more so than they are to some vision of identity politics or rugged individualism. And some research on public opinion that's coming out, like what the Harwood Institute is doing, bears that out. But if the change can't start on the level of elected officials, if Washington is going to be the tail rather than the dog leading this, what needs to happen to encourage folks on a, for lack of a better term, grassroots level, who are already there to start creating a space for themselves in the discourse, rather than just feeling alienated by the fact that the discourse is dominated by people who aren't there yet?
Thank you. One more in this round, John. Yeah.
If things are going to be better, it's going to be because of leaders like the people on the stage. You both paid tribute to Catholic social teaching. It's worth noting, this week actually is the 50th anniversary of Pacem Terris by John the 23rd, and if you reread it, it's more about the common good than it is about peace. So this is a powerful thing. I'm interested in your thoughts on the relationship between another principle of Catholic teaching and the common good, and that is the priority for the poor and the common good. How do those two fit together? Jim's analysis that those who have made a deity out of choice, there's not much room for the poor in that equation, and those who worship at the altar of the unfettered market, not much room for the poor in that religion either. But if it's all are responsible for all, the poor are part of that, variation is the greatest good for the greatest number, and that could leave the poor out. What is the connection between an argument based on the common good versus a justice argument that says we ought to put the poor first?
Jim?
Well, first of all, on the history, the cover of the book is the Lincoln Memorial, and my favorite quote from Abraham Lincoln is on the front of the book. My concern is not whether God is on our side. My greatest concern is to be on God's side. Now, I used to take inner city kids to the Lincoln Memorial. It's my favorite of all monuments. When I was teaching kids how to read, and I would just stand with them, you know, in front of the second inaugural and help them sound out syllable by syllable, sentence by sentence. So they're learning to read, but I wanted them to read those words with malice toward none, with charity for all. This was a divided nation, north against south, family against family, brother against brother, church against church. And Lincoln flipped the question, which is always we want to bring God into our side. He flipped the question, what does it mean to be in God's side? He would have said he didn't know everything it meant to be in God's side, but that was the right question. It was a kind of a humility he was encouraging us to act. So historically, we've had other times of division for sure, but hardly ever as divisive as that moment when Lincoln gave that second inaugural. I quoted here, read that second inaugural again, because he's saying this is the right question. What does it mean to be on God's side? So it always takes flipping the question, it always takes kind of humility, which is not common to our politics, not common even to the churches often. The humility to say, we may not have this right. On John's point, I remember a meeting John was in with the president. It was a debt crisis time, a year and a half ago. And in the meeting, the bishop who represented the conference in that meeting, in a very powerful way, said, Mr. President, we're not, the text that obliges us to be here, that compels our obedience, does not say, as you've done to the middle class, you've done to me. Hearing what the White House always talked about. It says, as you've done to the least of these, you've done to me. And the president said, I know that text. And so we said, then we're asking you to exempt low-income entitlements from the sequester, which we believe is going to go into effect, and it has. Low-income entitlements, we said, exempt. And for an hour, we debated that, as you recall. And they didn't agree to that, and an hour later they called and agreed to it. And then because of other conversations, some of the Republicans agreed not to oppose that if it happened, and so low-income entitlements are protected in the sequester. Not all, but low-income entitlements are. And so I think the scriptures clearly say that the ultimate moral metric of the common good is how the poor and vulnerable are treated. This is the prophets say this is the test, this is the moral test of the righteousness, or we'd say integrity of any society, is how the poor and vulnerable are being treated. Now, who the poor and vulnerable are gets politicized by the left and the right, and they select who their poor and vulnerable are. But that principle is what we always bring in a meeting, the circle of protection, which was John's idea, by the way. In a meeting with one of the senators, Gang of 8, I remember we had the meeting with him, and I said, now, Senator, you and I could pick the 12 senators who could find a path to fiscal sustainability, couldn't we? He said, yes, we could. Both sides, both Republicans and they could protect our principle in the circle of protection of protecting the poorest and most vulnerable, couldn't they? He says, yes, they could. But then the interests would all come into the room. They come into your conference room all the time, and they demand their expenditures. And the poor would be compromised, wouldn't they? The senator said, that's exactly what happens. The circle of protection was there to say, we don't want that to happen. So the poor and the vulnerable finally are, I think, the test, the biblical test of the common good, I would say.
I would only add to that on the last issue of the poor and vulnerable, that we owe the problem this seriousness of study and sophistication. Robert Putnam of Harvard has a new book coming out where he analyzes this problem of stalled mobility. And he calls it, which I think is a vivid phrase, a perfectly purple problem, meaning that red and blue ideologies both have an important contribution to make the debate. So some of it is family structure and value structure and failed public education institutions, and some of it is, atomized communities essentially pulverized by globalization and technological change and kind of systemic economic problems. And if we're going to solve those problems, it's actually going to require a broad ideological framework in order to make it work. And so I would only say that I think a preferential option for the poor, I think, requires us to put their interest, at the top when it comes to social priorities, and it requires us to take the problem serious enough for study. And there's a lot of people that need to make contributions in that area for it to work. I'd only add then, on the other side, I think political change comes bottom up and top down. I mean, it just is, the reality is, this is a mundane example, but a leader like Bill Clinton or a leader like Tony Blair that wants to change certain fundamentals about his party, it requires their leadership, and then it requires essentially primary audiences that will, are fed up with losing or are willing to accept broad change or even pushing for, the party to change. These are minor examples, but it's often the way things happen is that you get a genuine desire for something to shift or change. And then you get a leader, who, with the sophistication to make it into a movement. And so it's a dynamic relationship.
But your point about space is really important here, because often in this town, the political leaders who really got into public service, most of them because they wanted to make a contribution to service, but they feel trapped and stuck. They don't feel their space. So how do we create space for immigration reform? Create space for funding, malaria, HIV/AIDS prevention. Creating space out there. First, we got to create space out in the country for that conversation. So my best hope for this book is that it creates space for a conversation on the common good. A journalist asked me today about, they said, Lincoln, you talk about Lincoln a lot on the God side, but he didn't go to church much. So what do you make of that? And it was a very interesting question. And I thought Lincoln might have been one of the first none of the aboves. The people who click what they affiliate with, none of the above, because he clearly was wrestling with what it meant to be on God's side, but he didn't go to church much. Maybe he looked at religion and just didn't like what he saw and was one of the first none of the aboves. So one of the things that I think, and I'll end with this, when people of faith actually say and do the things that their faith says they should say and do, two things happen. One, people are surprised. Second, they're attracted. They're surprised and they're attracted. So I hope this space for this conversation can surprise people and attract people. And Sunday we had a great event in Boston, and this young man hovering and hanging around after finally said, I've been an agnostic, maybe even an atheist sometimes, but I'll tell you, if people of faith, if we could have this conversation with people of faith, I could come back into it. So that, I think, is a conversation that I'd like to really make space for. And that's really why I wrote the book, to make space for that conversation.
Well, that's going to have to be the last word on our formal conversation. And I think it's a very appropriate last word. We will be able to continue more informally. We have a reception out here to which you all are invited. There's also a table at which you can look at the book or purchase the book, and Jim has agreed to sign the book for you if you're interested. So please have a look there. In closing, thanks again for coming out this evening, and please join me in thanking Jim and Mike.